We started a new field of study, and we're calling it today, all right, let me see, here we go. We're calling it Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, a practical guide to life, relationships, and love. Amen. People have asked me over the years, Pastor, could you please do some teaching related to these matters, these issues? We need to know what the standard is for God's people when it comes to how we ought to conduct ourselves, not just in terms of interpersonal activities and actions, but also in terms of relationships, dating, marriage, all these sorts of things. In the mainstream, the churches have all kinds to offer people. If you go to their churches, well, they're happy to give you all kinds of classes and all kinds of Bible studies on relationships and marriage and these sorts of things. But it seems that these matters tend to be overlooked a lot of times in affirming circles. Well, they shouldn't be, because this is very important. If you're a Christian, whether you're an LGBT Christian or not, there is still the issue of integrity.
Absolutely.
There is still the issue of morality.
Yes.
Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not certain that I would define the word morality the same way that many people do. Many people define morality as, some kind of a code of ethics or a code of behavior, a series of rules and regulations. That is not what morality is about. Morality has to do with our conduct toward one another. That's what morality has its foundation in, how we treat one another. When you look at the 10 Commandments, they are divided into two categories. The first 4 deal with man's relationship with God.
Correct.
The last 6 deal with man's relationship with man. Right. Thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. All of these things have to do with our conduct one toward another. I got news for you. There are things that you can do that really have no bearing on anybody but yourself. And for that reason, it is nobody's business what you do but yourself.
Amen.
That's a fact. There are issues that are not a matter of morality. Child abuse, child molestation is a morality issue. You have a victim. Rape is a morality issue. You have a victim. Incest is a morality issue. You have a victim. Okay? Prostitution. I hate to tell you, some people in the LGBT community want me to be light on this. I'm sorry, I can't. It is a morality issue because you have a victim. No, you don't. Yes, you do.
Yes, you do.
Yes, you do. You've got one spouse who is either lying to their spouse in order to engage in adultery, which is a moral issue. You have a victim. All right? Or they're risking your health and welfare by being with someone who may have health issues and bringing it home to you. So yes, prostitution is considered a morality issue, okay? So there are morality issues, but morality issues directly are related to circumstances and situations, activities where there is a victim. One of the things that kills me about people who try to demonize homosexuality and transsexuality and this sort of thing, they try to paint this picture that society as a whole is the victim, that there is a victim here. Society falls victim to this. And it is so ridiculous because before too long, you can claim society is the victim for using a public restroom, okay? You can make that argument for virtually anything. It's a ridiculous argument. As long as you are dealing with two people who are in agreement and nobody is victimizing the other, it is not a morality issue. The moment, for whatever reasons, there is a victim, it is a morality issue. Well, how can that be? Well, how about when you use somebody to get your jollies and you have to convince them that you're really interested in them and you really do care about them and you really do like them, but in reality you know good and well that your thoughts are not their thoughts. You're not on the same page. I'm going to tell you a little secret. That is immoral. You are victimizing that other individual. You're not caring for their psychological and their emotional welfare. That is victimizing that other person, and that is not something a Christian should do.
Right.
I hope y'all think I'm telling the truth tonight. Amen. All right. We've gotten through the point where we talked about the ABCs of life. Always be Christ-like. When it comes to interpersonal relationships, when it comes to dating and preparing for marriage, this rule still stands as our standard. Always be Christ-like. You see, there aren't different rules for different circumstances. So, well, when you do business, always be Christ-like. But when you're in romantic situations, well, that's different. You approach, no. No, the ABCs of Christian living, the ABCs apply to every single situation in your life across the board without exception. Now, we seem to have people in our world today. Oh my goodness. This page didn't print for me. Well, yeah, it did, I guess. Okay. We have people in our world today who have all kinds of goofy ideas about certain issues and certain subjects. So I want to read, it's a little bit of a lengthy article. I mean, it'll probably take me a good 6 or 8 minutes to read it, I suppose, possibly longer. But I want to read to you an article that is titled A Brief Cultural History of Sex. Pastor, you said the 3-letter word? Yes. Let's start with the Greeks. Aphrodisiac, eroticism, homosexuality, narcissism, nymphomania, pederasty, all these terms are derived from the language of ancient Greece, which tells you something about its society. The myths of Homer and Plutarch told stories such as that of Aphrodite, goddess of sexual intercourse, who emerged from the foaming semen of her father's castrated testicles. Boy, I'm glad my God isn't one of these nuts. Then there were the mortal heroes, such as Hercules, who it is said ravaged 50 virgins in a single night, but who also had an affair with his nephew, Iolaus, and fell in love with sweet Hylas, he of the curling locks. From the early 6th century to the early 4th century, the culture of pederasty flourished in Athens, with adult men taking adolescent boys to serve as their lovers. Although how much physical sex actually happened is a matter of some debate. Women in ancient Greece were generally the property of men, and rarely enjoyed the exalted status of the young homosexual partner. But we know that there was a strong culture of female prostitution, with the most successful courtesans often wielding power and wealth, and with brothels paying a state tax on their profits. Neglected wives found ways to satisfy their desires. Lesbians, called tribedes, certainly existed, and the culture is associated most particularly with the island of Lesbos, quote, where burning Sappho loved and sung, end quote. There are also plenty of literary references to the use of, I'm going to change the wording here a little bit, just to be nice, sexual tools for self-gratification, which in ancient Greece were made of padded leather and anointed with olive oil before use. Now, I know there's some people out there, their hair just falling out of their head. Pastor, I can't believe you're reading this article. Well, believe it, because there's some good information here. Now, we go to the Romans. In Rome, as elsewhere in the ancient world, wives and children belonged to the man of the family. A woman caught in the act of adultery could be killed by her husband on the spot, while a wife who drank more than a moderate amount of wine gave grounds for divorce. Despite this, the orgiastic culture of legend certainly existed during the Bacchanalian festivals when all restraint was abandoned. Such was the hedonism and lawlessness of these rites, with rampant couplings of both heterosexual and homosexual nature, that public worship of Bacchus was finally outlawed in 186 BCE. Prostitution was widespread and legal, and the Greek tradition of pederasty was significant enough to cause concern when the Roman birth rate dropped. Much attention was given to the development of contraception. Pliny recommended, quote, mouse dung applied in the form of a liniment, end quote, or pigeon droppings mixed with oil and wine. Much more successful was the method devised by the gynecologist Cyrenus of Ephesus, who suggested a wool plug for the uterus impregnated with gummy substances. However, it is more likely that outbreaks of plague and disease led to the catastrophic fall in the population of the Roman Empire than the success of primitive contraception. Then we come into the Christian era. According to Rie Tannahill's book, Sex in History, the years between 400 AD and 1000 AD saw Christian morality gain a grip on Western thought, quote, so paralyzing that it is only now beginning to relax, end quote. Many of its rules regarding sex originate in the Hebrew law of the Old Testament and were fixed firm for over 1,500 years, with threats of hellfire proving one of the most successful deterrents ever invented. Lust and sex became associated with the original sin of Adam and Eve, and the celibate life was promoted for those with the most godly minds. An indication of how poorly early Christians viewed sex is the fact that they declared Jesus to have been conceived without carnal contact. Now, mind you, this is a secular writer, okay? We believe that. Incest, masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, homosexuality were all deemed sinful and punishable by the Christian church with increasing severity. Sex within marriage was tolerated, listen, for reproductive purposes only, and contraception banned because of its association with pleasure. We know little of how these rules affected the lives of ordinary people, but the threat of damnation almost certainly transformed sex into activity loaded with fear and danger. The Renaissance, the spread of syphilis to epidemic proportions across Europe in the 16th century, reveals that many men and women were not as chaste as the church would have liked. Prostitution was large scale across the continent. There were 7,000 public women in Rome in the year 1490, and the brothels of Southwark in London were notorious. The church accepted the situation as a necessary evil, arguing that at least sin was contained. But times were definitely changing. Italian Renaissance painting and sculpture reveals the rediscovery of the art of antiquity, when the naked flesh of men and women were worshipped and enjoyed rather than regarded as sinful. Homosexuality was tolerated in certain areas and classes. Among artists such as Leonardo and Michelangelo, for example, and even in the court of James I in London, where the king paraded his lover, the Duke of Buckingham, in public. Although a Buggery Act was introduced for the first time in 1533, making sodomy between men punishable by death, it was rarely acted upon. Indeed, the homosexual Duke of Sutherland was able to rise to the position of prime minister in the early 18th century, and only forced to resign when satirical stories were published about the gay sex club he had established. Enlightenment literature, in novels such as Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, and most strongly in the novels of the Marquis de Sade, outlined the dangers and excitements of sexual perversion and revealed the extent to which sex had moved away from the guilt-laden act of the Middle Ages to become an intoxicating, if risky, source of pleasure. Let's get to the Victorian era. A combination of overt gentility and ignorance turned the 19th century into the most rotten age that has ever been for sexuality. In Britain, the ideal of the middle-class wife, safely installed with her family in a burgess home, was the universal ideal. But the repression of natural urges led to a dark underground world of debauchery and vice. As the purity of the wifely figure was promoted, once-a-month sex was generally considered enough. I know people still live by that rule. Prostitution became more widespread than ever before. In 1839, in London, a city of 2 million inhabitants, there were estimated to be around 80,000 prostitutes. Later in the century, Prime Minister William Gladstone found the problem so pressing that he would walk the streets himself at night and counsel these working girls. Some courtesans, Little Langtry, for example, reached the highest echelons of society and even managed to retain an air of respectability. But venereal disease was rife, and syphilis spread widely between prostitutes, their clients, and their clients' families. Randolph Churchill, father of Winston, is a well-known example. Thus, quote, clean virgins became a highly desirable commodity. although faking it was so easy that by the 1880s the price had dropped from 100 earlier in the century to just 5 a session. Homosexuality had generally enjoyed a period of tolerance until 1885, when the Criminal Law Amendment Act stated that gross indecency between men would be punishable by 2 years imprisonment. It was this law known as the Blackmailer's Charter, under which Oscar Wilde was convicted in 1895 and which remained on the statute books until 1967. Indeed, the whole confused and hypocritical attitude of the Victorians towards sexuality had long-lasting repercussions. We then come to modern life. Not until after the Second World War did any real cracks begin to show in the Victorian moral code. The freedom many men and women felt as war workers made it hard to go back to the old life once peace came. This is illustrated by the Kinsey reports of 1948, which found that 69% of men in the U.S. had visited prostitutes. 50% of husbands had been unfaithful to their wives, and 37% of men and 17% of women had had at least one homosexual experience. During the 1960s, many old ideas were swept away by what we now call the sexual revolution. The introduction of easily available contraception in the form of the pill gave women more control and allowed them to indulge in sex for pleasure, often with multiple partners. In 1972, Alex Comfort's book, The Joy of Sex, was published and soon became the best-selling manual for a new generation. But the arrival of the lethal AIDS virus in the West had a huge impact on the idea of free love in the 1980s. Since the virus can be transmitted by sex, it is no surprise to hear that a common reaction of the public, summed up by a letter to Time magazine in 1988, was a call to return to, quote, the God-fearing moral standard of yesterday, end quote. But could conservatives ever effectively reinvoke the deterrent of hellfire? It's a losing battle. New figures from the World Health Organization show that 39% of girls in Britain have had underage sex, and 34% of young boys, the highest rates in Europe. We might not approve, but the sexual revolution goes on. Now, I've just given you a little bit of an idea of the culture of sex through the centuries. There have been different things that have affected, how they viewed things, how they looked at things. But one of the things that really gets me is how ignorant the church is about how sex and marriage and women were viewed even in biblical times. It really makes me laugh. When all this debate about gay marriage was going on, I really got a chuckle out of people, well, marriage has always been, my God, going back thousands of years, it's been defined this way. You are so full of baloney. That argument is such garbage. It is pure fiction. It is absolute fiction. The truth of the matter is, at one time, including in Hebrew culture, women were in fact property. Marriage had nothing to do with love. It wasn't about love. Oftentimes a woman was forced into a marriage. If her father said, I want you to marry this fella, then by God, you married that fella. That's all there was to it. The gentleman would present a dowry to the father of the bride, and if he was happy with the payment, he, in essence, sold his daughter to be married to that man. That was the transaction that was marriage in ancient times. That's what marriage was all about in ancient times. So get out of your ignorance and your foolishness, church, in thinking that marriage has always been what it is now. That is so foolish. Well, I've got news for you. Sexual mores and the way that people viewed interpersonal intimacy was also very different, is very different than what most people believe. In ancient cultures, the reality is, and I've talked about this in the past now, I have studied extensively the Jewish mindset and the Jewish attitude and teaching concerning homosexuality, for instance. I've actually looked into it. I said, if the Christian church sprang forth from Judaism, then it only makes sense that we try to get an understanding of how the Jews looked at these subjects. Well, I'm going to tell you what I read and what I studied. It absolutely staggers my mind. It literally just knocks me over. The reality is, first of all, according to the law of Moses, not one word has been said of women being with women. Now, what a lot of people don't understand, you have the first 5 books of the Bible which constitute the law, the Torah. Those 5 books which constitute the Torah, that is not the only writing that the Jews refer to and rely upon when it comes to their teaching. No. They also have another set of writings from rabbis that they consider to be the greatest of their historical rabbis. And these rabbis have written their thoughts and their opinions and their beliefs about how the Torah is to be applied. And they will refer to these teachings of the ancient rabbis, okay? And they refer to these books which have been written with the thoughts of these ancient rabbis. And it is amazing to me to find out that nowhere in ancient Jewish thought was homosexuality considered to be unnatural or innately evil or wicked or vulgar or nasty. They didn't see it that way. They did not represent it that way. They did not speak of it that way. No, they said, we see it as something that is perfectly natural. We see it as something that happens. We see it as, the matter of fact, they saw it a little more liberally, perhaps, than even we do today. Their attitude was, well, you put 2 men together and they get horn-doggled enough, they're likely to do anything. Well, I don't know if I quite agree with that, but, I think there has to be a little more going on than, But anyway, but this was their mindset. So many of the ancient rabbis would actually, based on the teaching of the Torah, they would actually recommend the prohibition of even 2 men sharing a bed. They said no. And the reason that their teaching is based on the Torah, but it's going that next step. It's saying, okay, if the Torah says 2 men should not engage in a certain specific type of sexual conduct, then their teaching is, well, how do we prevent this then from happening? Do you follow what I'm saying? And their teaching is based on the pervasive mindset about all things sexual at their time. So they're looking at it as, well, you put 2 men in the same bed, it's altogether possible they're going to get frisky and things are going to happen. Therefore, in order to prevent this from happening, we say that 2 men should not share the same bed. What's interesting is, you may remember Jesus teaching, talking about the rapture. And he said there'll be two men lying in a bed. One shall be taken and the other shall be left. Lord, you just violated the teaching of the great rabbis of old. You just suggested that what the great rabbis of old say shouldn't happen. Two men sharing one bed. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
I'm going to tell you something, folks. There are things the Lord said that you don't realize what he was saying. You don't realize the full impact of what he was saying because you don't understand the full context of Jewish thinking and Jewish teaching. When the Lord said, two men will be in one bed, I believe with all my heart. I believe this every ounce of my being. He was saying one of them can be saved and one of them can be lost. Hallelujah to God. They can both be LGBT, but one of them can be saved and one of them can be lost. That tells me you can be LGBT and be saved.
Amen.
Hallelujah.
Amen.
Said there'll be two men in one bed. One will be taken and the other one is left. They had very specific rules. As part of their teaching, for instance, if a woman was to make a trip or make a journey, she could only make the journey with the accompaniment of a man. And if it wasn't her husband, listen to this, then they would actually not, she would not be able to go with another man, a different man than her husband, but rather she would have to go with two men. There'd have to be two, because one would have to look after the other one. This is how, you don't understand. When Jesus came, this is what he was dealing with. This is why he was constantly saying, you've heard it said, thus and so. He was not quoting the Torah. He was quoting these great rabbis. You've heard it said, the common teaching that Jews today embrace. They say, love your friends and hate your enemies. But I say unto you, do you follow what I'm saying? So the Lord was not combating all the time. He was not combating the interpretation of the Torah. He was combating the application of the Torah, the law. Okay? Now, when you look, for instance, at the law as it relates so-called to homosexuality, the reality is that passages in the Old Testament law that are most commonly used to condemn gay men, because there's not a word in the law about women. And believe it or not, these ancient rabbis, they actually set ages for when the young women could become sexually active, and they placed no prohibition on women being with women. They talked about it. They understood it happened. No prohibition. Said as long as the younger party is over 17, or as long as the younger party is over this certain age. Literally, that's the way they set it up. And yet, we've got people in the church, oh, by God, no, the law condemned everything related to LGBT. Why, hook, line, and sinker, everything there is, it condemned. Wrong. Wrong. Some of the passages that are commonly used to condemn LGBT actually haven't got a thing in the universe to do with sexual orientation, sexual desire, sexual attraction. It has to do with religious sexual practice. religious sexual practice that was associated with certain religions. In ancient times, the vast majority of religions, all those that sprang forth from Babylon, shared a common core belief. They were very phallic. They were very focused on the notion of human reproduction. And the sexual act was celebrated. It was literally, the male organs were literally worshipped, folks. And there were times as part of their religious practice. Now, we look back and we say, oh, well, that's disgusting. I've never heard of such a thing. Well, of course you haven't. The world's changed in the last several thousand years. But in those times, if you wanted your crops blessed, if you wanted to be well-to-do, if you wanted your business blessed, if you wanted your family and your children blessed, if you wanted your wife to have children, you literally had to engage in a sexual act with a representative from the temple, and you had to do this act all the way through to a happy ending. I'll try to say this as gently as I can. I don't want to get banned on YouTube and Vimeo and everywhere else. I'm going to try to say this as gently as I can. You'd have to pursue this to a happy ending, if I may say it that way. And at that point, you would have secured whatever blessing. And in order to commit this sex act with a representative from the temple, you had to pay. Well, the temple priests could not accommodate all the people, Lisa, in a community who worshiped at that temple. So what they did is they hired individuals who would work for the temple, on behalf of the temple, and they would receive a portion of the money that was paid. And these people were known as what we call, or what were called, temple prostitutes. I got news for you. The word that is translated in the New Testament, King James Version, sodomite, is literally translated correctly, temple prostitute. So it has nothing at all to do with Sodom as it relates to homosexual behavior, so-called, supposedly. No, it has to do with Sodom only in the sense that Sodom engaged in this type of idolatry. Do you follow?
Yeah.
Do you see why information is so important? Do you see why it's so important to understand these things, folks? So, within the context of the Old Testament law that God gave to Moses, I've read a number of rabbis, great rabbis, old and new, contemporary and ancient, and they know and they believe that God gave the law to Moses concerning men engaging in a certain specific type of intercourse. The most conservative Jewish interpretation of certain passages within the law says that a man cannot engage in anal intercourse with another man. That is it. If you're gay, if you're a gay man, you know that there's a whole lot more to intimacy with another male than simply anal intercourse. Am I telling the truth? So there's a whole lot of ways to be intimate with somebody that doesn't involve that. The law did not condemn any of those other activities. Are you hearing me? So when you get these ignorant, stupid people out there call themselves Christians saying, we just need to kill the homosexuals. The law of God says we need it. No, the law of God does not say that. Not by a million miles. Not by a million miles. No, the most conservative, now mind you, there's different thoughts as to how these things are interpreted as well. But the most conservative reading, the most conservative interpretation was that only this one specific act was forbidden. It was not forbidden because it was innately evil. It was not forbidden because it was the manifestation of some wickedness. It was not forbidden because it was disgusting or deplorable or it was contrary to nature. No, the Jews did not see that way. They said, no, it's forbidden the same way that God forbade the Jewish people from eating shellfish. Literally. Literally. This is the Jewish understanding of this law, folks. They said, no. God says the consumption of certain types of animals is an abomination. Said all of the things that are classified as an abomination, there is nothing evil about eating a lobster. There is nothing innately wicked about eating a crab. There is nothing, unnatural about sitting down and having some shrimp. It said the same thing is true of this one specific item. But the law, God does not offer within the context of the law vagaries. And yet Christians today try to present the law of Moses as a bunch of vagaries. He said a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman. But it only makes sense that a woman can't lie with a woman as with a man, right? Now, haven't you heard that argument? You see, and they don't understand that's not how the law works. If God says you cannot bend down on the Sabbath day and pick up a nickel, guess what? You can bend down on the Sabbath day, pick up a penny. You can bend down on the Sabbath day and pick up a dime. You can bend down on the Sabbath day and pick up a quarter. You can bend down on the Sabbath day and pick up a $50. You can bend down on the Sabbath day and pick up paper money. The only thing you're forbidden from bending down and picking up is what God said you can't pick up, which is a nickel. Do you follow what I'm saying? The law is not vague. It is specific to the letter, which is why Jesus said that not one jot nor one tittle would go unfulfilled, because it's specific to the letter. Everything in the law was extremely specific. Now, when you read the modern Jewish rabbis, they talk about the fact that the people of Israel were given the law through Moses at Mount Sinai because they were headed into a land that they would claim as their own, that they were going to colonize and populate, and they were going to make a nation. They were going to create a nation. And there was an imperative. If they were going to establish the nation of Israel in Palestine, in the Promised Land, in Canaan, it was imperative. I mean, not mildly imperative. It was imperative that they procreate like bunny rabbits. It was imperative. This was absolutely necessary. Why? They needed it for self-survival. They needed it for self-protection, Martin. They had to procreate. They had to populate that land as quickly as they possibly could, which is why God banned within the law any number of sexual acts that involved what one might call the wasting of seed, of the male seed, okay? There were a number of prohibitions on acts. You see, that male-on-male intercourse like that, why was that forbidden? Because it produced wasted seed. That seed would go to, there's not going to be any babies born out of that. Well, by the same token, he didn't want men having a solo party either. Okay? Why? Because it's morally wrong? Because it's evil? Because it produced wasted seed. At one point, God even told the children of Israel that he would prefer that the seed of a man go into the belly of a whore than be spilt upon the ground. Okay? That he wanted them to procreate, he wanted them to create as many people as they could for self-survival. Okay? There's a reason why since 1948, since the nation of Israel once again organized and came into being, there's a reason why the Israeli government is reaching out across the world and inviting Jews from all over the world to come back to Israel. Why? Because they want a bunch of people that they can collect taxes from? No, they need it for self-survival. You need as many people there having babies, having children, because then those children can join the army, then those children can join the Navy, then those children can be in the Air Force. You follow what I'm saying? That is the mentality. That was the purpose behind what God gave in the law. By the way, got a little news for you, my Christian friend who's oblivious and ignorant. The law was given to Israel. It was not based on moral prerogative. It was not based on what is moral and what is immoral. No, it was based on the needs of the fledgling nation of Israel. So to stand here in the pulpit and say, "This God, the law of God said that we ought to just stone every homosexual," well, that's you are at the apex of ignorance. You can't get any dumber than that, okay? You really can't, because you just don't get it. You just don't understand how this works. The law was given to Israel. That was the purpose behind many of those laws. Don't have a thing in the universe to do with our nation or our society today. Has nothing to do with anything, okay? So there's a lot of misunderstanding about the ancient mindset. In ancient times, men would often take young men, you heard me talk about it in Greek society, as lovers. Now there's a lot of debate as to if and what kind of sexual activity may have been engaged in. But the reality is, these young men oftentimes had nothing to do with them being gay. Nor did they grow up to live as homosexuals. One of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life, and sadly this particular guy is famous for just spewing one idiotic statement after another. Ben Carson. Now, I've heard he's supposed to be some brilliant brain scientist. I wouldn't want that man with 100 miles in my skull, I'll tell you right now. He was speaking here recently, and I read something where he said, well, you know, of course homosexuality is learned behavior. Of course homosexuality is a choice. How many men go into prison straight and they come out gay? Oh, my goodness. That's the most idiotic pile of junk I ever heard. No, when you're going to spend your life in prison and you get all horn-doggled up, you will take advantage of what's available to you. Most of these people, when they get out of prison, are no more interested in identifying as LGBT than they are identifying as an alien from outer space. No, that is not their preference. That is not their orientation. nor do they change their orientation. There's a passage in the New Testament, in the book of Romans, chapter 1, where Paul talks about people exchanging their natural affections for something that is not natural to them. Well, of course that means homosexuals. No, it doesn't. No, their orientation is perfectly natural to them. But are there people who will exchange their natural affections for that which is not natural to them, strictly out of lust and strictly out of necessity and strictly out of convenience? Yes, there are. Prisons are full of them. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yes.
So again, we have people who want to translate a passage. They read it and they want to interpret it in their own manner, in a way that is comfortable for them. And they read this in Romans 1 and immediately they translate it as, oh, this is talking about homosexuals. Well, no, it isn't. Because if it's talking about homosexuals, number one, that would have to mean that their affections were unnatural to them to begin with. I got news for you. I did not ever wake up and decide one day that I was going to trade in my natural feelings for feelings that were not natural to me. No, got news for you. My feelings were as natural to me as breathing air. I had no more control over what I was thinking and what I was feeling than I did the color of my hair, the color of my eyes. So therefore, what Paul writes in Romans chapter 1 has nothing in the world to do with people who have an orientation so that, their sexual identity is based on orientation. That's not what Paul's talking about. He's talking about people who literally they purposely decided that they would do that which was not natural to them for convenience, because of lust. He said they burned in their own lust because of lust. Now, I'm going to tell you, I know people, both heterosexual and otherwise, who are so full of lust. I've known people like this over the years. They would do it with anything and everybody, and they just don't even care. They don't care if you're a man or a woman. They don't care. And it doesn't have a thing in the world to do with orientation. No. They may be fully attracted to women, but if given the opportunity, they're like, hey, why not? Whatever. Years ago, I decided I wanted to take courses at a community college, and I wanted to go full-time, so I gave up my apartment. I got a room at a boarding house type situation, a rooming house, and I was living in this rooming house, and there was a guy. He was a nice-looking kid, young guy. I was young at the time as well, and I was out of church. Matter of fact, this is about the first year that I came out, and he would ask me sometimes if I'd go to straight clubs with him and stuff, And if I didn't have anything to do and I was bored, I'd say, yeah, why not? I'd go with him, I never was a drinker, so I just would go and maybe drink a soda or something, And it's so funny because every straight club I've ever been in, I can honestly say this, every straight bar, every straight club I've ever been in, I have seen violence. I have seen men picking fights with other men. I've seen jealousy. I've seen all this foolishness going on. Go to a gay bar. I could count on one hand, probably on two fingers, how many times in a gay bar I've ever seen any kind of fight break out, any kind of violence break out. But you go to a straight club and see if it don't happen every stinking night. My brother Michael used to be a truck driver, and he'd come into town when I was living in New York City, and he'd want me to go with him to some club or bar or whatever, and I went with him. And every single time, I had men looking at me. What you looking at my girlfriend for? I said, buddy, I'm as interested in your girlfriend as I am having a tractor driven over my head. But every single time, Martin. And yet gay people we are demonized, and we are made to be this evil, wicked, horrible. Well, isn't it funny for a bunch of horrible, wicked people? Isn't it funny how that there is nowhere near the levels of violence and nowhere near the levels of volatility that you see in testosterone-driven straight circles? Well, anyway, this guy, he wanted me to go to clubs with him, so I'd go with him. One night he kind of drank and had a little too much to drink and all that. And we're coming home, and he's saying to me, I thought maybe sometime I could try da-da-da-da. I said, not with me, you don't. Not with me, you don't. Well, because I think you're a really great guy. I said, not with me, you don't. I'm going to tell you, I'm offended by the stupidity of people in our community, and these are unchurched people, so I have to give them a little bit of slack. But when you put out pornography and you put out stories and stuff about gay men seducing straight men, all you're doing, you big moron, is causing your own trouble. All you're doing is feeding the conservative bile. Yeah. You're giving them wood to throw on the fire, because they're out there telling people that we got a bunch of queers out there trying to convert the straight community and turn everybody gay. And I hate that notion. That annoys me to no bloody end. If you find some pleasure, if you pat yourself on the back because somehow, some way, a straight guy finds you attractive and you're able to turn a straight guy on, honey, got news for you. I highly doubt that ruler was too straight to start with.
Yeah, that's right.
You dummy. That's probably somebody who's already wrestling with issues. They may very well at the extreme least be bisexual, but they can't even admit to that. All right? But, this notion of it's such a thrill that I just love straight men. Oh, please. Please, that's foolishness. But I'm going to tell you, this kid, he's talking to me, and I said, kiddo, not with me, you're not. Not with me, you're not. Because I know who I am. I know what's going on in my head and in my heart and in my body. And you don't. And I'm not interested in anybody that don't. Because what you're looking for is an experiment. Well, I'm not here to be experimented with. I'm not an experimental toy. I'm a human being. I'm trying to find a relationship, trying to find the love of my life. I ain't trying to just satisfy your momentary drunken, interests. All right. So now we come to the matter of, I don't have much time tonight, so have I done all right tonight? Have I said anything helpful? I hope so. We're going to move into, but I think we may have to wait until next week. I think it might be wiser to wait until next week. But what we're going to do next week, we are going to begin to look at what I'm going to call the path to matrimony. We're going to talk about, now let me explain something to you. This pastor has a different understanding and a different belief than a lot of preachers in the Christian church world. I do not believe that the Bible addresses every single tiny issue in the world. I don't. I find people who claim that usually have to really dig and twist and pervert Scripture in order to find something that they can use to support, what they're trying to say. And I have a problem with that. Because in ancient times, marriage was a very different experience than it is today, a very different thing. Obviously, it would be absurd, be utterly absurd, to try to instruct people today on marriage when certain things that are written in Scripture are based on a very different mindset. No, we live in a world today where romance is at the center of the concept of matrimony, right? Everybody wants to fall in love. I got news for you. Right up through World War II, that was not necessarily the mindset. My grandmother told me, she said, I married at 17. My mother had to sign for me to get married. She said, we didn't even have the concept. Now, my grandmother was Portuguese. She said, we didn't even have the concept of falling in love and finding a man you just went gaga over. She said, that is not how we were raised. That is not how we looked at things. We were raised to find a man who would be a good provider. Said you looked for a man who was hardworking. Yeah. You looked for a man that had a good work ethic. You looked for a man that had integrity, that had these type of qualities. A man who didn't drink too much. A man who didn't womanize. She said those are the things you look for in a man. So we weren't even taught growing up, that, one of these days you're going to fall in love and you're going to find somebody you're going to go gog over. She said, when I met your grandfather, she said, honestly, I thought he was one of the homeliest men I ever laid eyes on. She said, but he was such a hard worker, and he was, and when you are conditioned to be attracted to certain attributes and traits, well, then that's what you're going to be attracted to. So she became attracted to my grandfather, but it had more to do with his work ethic. It had more to do with his hard work. You know what I'm saying? And he was in the army, and, and of course he'd come out after World War II, and they got married. And so there's a very different mindset about marriage. But in today's world, most people kind of have that fairy tale desire to find someone that they absolutely are crazy about. Not everybody can have my experience, Boomy. He's sitting there looking at me. I know he's just waiting to see if I'm going to say that that's been my experience. I just got a good one. And I was attracted to a lot of the good stuff, because there's a lot of good stuff there that goes way past the body, which has grown by a few inches since I met him. A lot of good stuff. And I'm going to tell you, we're going to talk about some of these things in the next couple of weeks. You better be looking for stuff that goes way past the skin, that goes way past the flesh, that goes way past their waist measurement. Because I got news for you, all those things change. Every one of them. All those things change. But if you have a mind to look for things that are beyond the shallow and beyond those things which are just temporary, then you'll find that you can have a love that lasts forever. You can, if you look for something more. When I met Tommy, I'm going to tell you, I honestly am saying this. I saw qualities in him that I really loved. Several qualities that I really, really, really was crazy about. That went past way past looks and all that. If you can't be attracted to more than looks, you got a problem, honey. It is a very immature mind that looks at the body and looks at the face and looks at the looks and is attracted to that primarily. And it's certainly an immature person who looks at that alone. Okay? I've told you before, when you're young and you're dating somebody and they decide that this isn't going anywhere and we need to break up, and you break up, and next thing you know, you see them with this horse face thing, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm way better looking than he is. Now, y'all laughing like every one of you understand what I'm saying. Because when you're young, that's how you see things. It's like, in terms of competing with, Joey, the horse-faced boy, I'm way better looking than he is, But the problem is, what turned that person off to you may have had not a thing in the world to do with your looks.
Right.
And what turned that person on to Joey, the horse-faced boy, may have to do with way beyond his looks. So you got to learn to have more to offer than just your body. You got to have more to offer than just your face. But we're going to look at this matter of what I call the road to matrimony. That's the little subtitle I'm giving it. And what I have to do is this. I'm going to give you what I believe is God-given, inspired counsel and advice, because the Bible does not address every one of these issues. But I got news for you. The Spirit of the Lord still talks to the church. So we don't have to have a scripture verse to point to for everything. Sometimes we just need to get some good, wise counsel from the Holy Ghost. Amen. And I think over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be able to help people understand the concept of dating. What is dating? What should you be doing during dating? The concept of courtship. There's something we don't even talk about anymore. People nowadays meet today, fall into bed, and then, they're engaged the next day and they're married before the weekend. Well, that's why relationships end as quickly as they do. I've got news for you, children. Nothing in this world can survive and last for any length of time if you do not invest in it. If you want a relationship that's going to last, you'd better learn to invest in that relationship. You'd better learn to invest in it before you put a ring on the finger. Yeah, I realize Miss Beyonce and her. If you like it, then you should have put a ring on it. If you like it, then you should have put a ring on it. I understand all that. But you know what? Don't be fool enough to put a ring on it just because you like it.
That's right. That is right.
It took me, let me tell you, it took this preacher a long time. When I came out and all that, I was very immature. I was very worldly unwise. Naive as all get out, believe it or not. I was naive as they come when I first come in. Took me a long time to learn some of these things, so I'm going to share some things with you in the next couple of weeks that are the benefit of many, many years of experience. And I'm going to help you to understand that one of the most important phases in a relationship is the dating phase. And you need to learn how to date. You need to learn what you're looking for while you're dating. You need to learn how to walk away when you realize that that person is not somebody that you would do well to invest yourself in. Because I'm going to tell you, you're going to date a lot of losers before you find your winner. And the thing that makes me laugh about people in our community, and heterosexual as well, How many people just fall into relationships and they're moving in after a couple weeks or a couple months, and they're constantly one after another having failed relationships. Well, if you'd understood how important dating is, I'm trying to give you a little insight of what we're going to look at in the next couple. Martin, do as many things with that person as you can do, because you know what? That person will show sides of themselves to you in different settings and in different circumstances. You'll see something in that person at an amusement park that you won't see at the movies. You'll see something in that person at the racetrack that you won't see at the restaurant. You'll see things in that person taking a road trip to Houston that you won't see sitting at home watching the television. So the wisest thing you can do during the course of dating is do as many various activities as you possibly can. Do as many different activities as you can. Because if you want to learn about that person, you need to see them in as many environments as you can. And you'll be shocked at what you'll learn sometimes. You think you got a winner. You think you got a sweetie. Then all of a sudden you're on a road trip going somewhere and he's cussing every car that passes him and he's, chasing up the rear end like he's going to slam them in the back and, and you're like, oh my Lord, who is this guy? Dating's important. That's where you weed out. But you know what? If you go rushing into claiming to make a commitment with somebody, there is no rule says you have to rush. There's no rule. The only thing that makes us rush is insecurity. But we'll go there next week. Would you stand with me this afternoon? Amen.